Hello, everybody. My name is Cameron, and this is my presentation about political organization in early China. Basically, I'm walking through how China went from small farming villages to full on dynasties, starting with the Xia, then the Shang, and finally the Zhou. I picked this topic because I thought it was interesting how a lot of what we think of as China politically, like the idea of a ruler needing legitimacy to stay in power, actually starts forming this early, way before anything we'd recognize as an empire. Over the next few slides, I'm going to go through the geography that made this possible, then each of the three dynasties, what made their governments work, and why they eventually fell apart. Let's get into it. Before getting into the actual dynasties, though, I want to set the scene geographically because it matters a lot. Early Chinese civilization grew up around the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. The Yellow River is nicknamed Huanghe, and it carried this thick yellow loess soil downstream that made the farmland around it very fertile. The catch is that the soil downstream um, sorry. The catch is that the same river flooded constantly and unpredictably, which caused so much destruction over the centuries that people started calling it China's sorrow. Interestingly, unlike Mesopotamia, this region usually got enough rainfall for crops, so early farmers didn't need to build the massive complex irrigation systems we saw in the Middle East. They still worked to dredge the river and build dikes to control flooding, though. As these farming populations grew, small villages turned into bigger towns, and eventually those towns needed real political organization to manage things like flood control on a larger scale. That's really the starting point for everything I'm about to cover. So the image just shows, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, and then it kind of shows. This picture shows the thick yellow loess soil um, that like tinted the river. Before the Xia dynasty even shows up, there were already Neolithic societies living in the same region, like the Yang Shao culture. One example is the settlement at Banpo village near modern Xi'an. These communities each had their own pottery styles, their own architecture, and their own political traditions. So this wasn't some empty land waiting for a dynasty to show up. People had already been organizing themselves for a while. What changed is that populations kept growing, and that growth created new problems village level leadership just couldn't handle anymore. Stuff like conflicts between villages or big projects like flood control that needed way more coordination. So there was this growing need for a recognized authority who can resolve disputes and organize larger scale public works. That need is basically the bridge between the smaller Neolithic communities and the emergence of the Xia dynasty, which I'll be covering next. This is the picture of the Banpo village, and then this is the picture of like what their pottery. They had a unique pottery style, and that's like a picture of what they made. So this brings me to the Xia dynasty, which is traditionally considered the first dynasty in Chinese history. But I want to be upfront that historians actually debate whether it actually existed than the way later dynasties did, because there's no solid archaeological proof, and most of what we know comes from stories written down later during the Zhou dynasty. According to the legend, the founder was a guy named Sage King Yu, and he's credited with organizing some of the first large scale public works projects in China, including efforts to control flooding, which ties back to the geography I mentioned earlier. What's actually important here historically is that the Shia helped establish the idea of hereditary rule, meaning political power stayed within one ruling family instead of being scattered and disorganized. That's a big deal because it was a more stable system, but even hereditary rule wasn't automatically permanent. Legend says that the Xia king became oppressive and ended up losing his kingdom to the founder of the next dynasty, the Shang. One piece of physical evidence that gets connected to the Shia is a site called Erletou. It's a late Neolithic settlement from around 1900 BCE, and it shows early bronze casting along with the beginnings of social stratification, meaning you can start to see different social classes forming. Some archaeologists think that the Erletou might actually be the Xia dynasty's capital, and the book kind of leans towards that idea, but it's important to say that um, the direct link is still a hypothesis because it's not confirmed. What matters here, though, is that even if we can't say for certain that the Shia capital, the bronze casting, and the social classes at Erlitou show that an organized political and social system was already developing. Um, that tells us even that tells us that even before that there were written records, people in the Yellow River Valley were already building that kind of political structures that the later dynasties would build on top of. Moving on to the Shang Dynasty, there is sorry. Moving on to the Shang Dynasty, this is where political organization gets a lot stronger. Tradition puts the Shang from about 1766 to 1122 BCE, and archaeology has mostly backed that up. The Shang kings controlled a huge territory, and they got their power through military strength and controlling key resources, specifically bronze production. They controlled the copper and tin needed to make bronze weapons and chariots, which made it extremely hard for rival groups to compete with them militarily. Records mention Shang armies as large as 30,000 troops, and one report of 13,000 enemy troops captured in a single campaign. Even if those numbers were exaggerated, it still shows how powerful their military force was. On top of that, the Shang king claimed a big chunk of agricultural surplus from the territories under his control and used that surplus to fund armies and reward political allies. Basically, the Shang combined military technology, monopolized resources, and economic control to dominate the region. Something I found really interesting in the reading was the role of oracle bones in Shang politics. Oracle bones were animal bones inscribed with characters, and they were used to ask questions to the royal ancestors about things like war, harvest, and even weather. But here's the key part: only the king and his court were allowed to ask ancestors these questions. That means religious authority and political authority were basically fused together under the Shang. If regular people believed that the king could actually communicate with their ancestors and get answers from the future, that gave him kind of a legitimacy that a pure military force could never get on its own. It's a smart move, honestly. It's not just I have the biggest army, it's the ancestors are on my side. And as a bonus, these oracle bone inscriptions are actually the earliest known form of Chinese writing, so they're a huge deal historically beyond just religion and politics. The Shang also didn't rule one tightly centralized state. Instead, they relied on a huge network of walled towns, possibly 1,000 more, where local rulers swore loyalty to the king, and the king would travel around to reinforce that loyalty. Their capitals actually moved at least 6 times over the course of the dynasty for political and military reasons. One example is the capital at Ao, where archaeologists found a massive pounded earth wall at least 10 meters high and 20 meters thick, and modern estimates suggest that building the wall alone took around 10,000 laborers working for almost 20 years. That's a massive amount of labor control. And then there's the tomb of Lady Fu Hao, a consort of the King Wu Ding, which is the only royal tomb at the capital that grave robbers had never found. Inside were 568 bronze objects, 755 jade carvings, and almost 7,000 cowrie shells, plus 16 human sacrifices. That tomb alone tells you how much wealth and power was concentrated at the top of the Shang society. So the picture here is like one of the bronze pieces found in the tomb, and then this is the picture of an example of like what the wall looked like, and then this photo here is what this is like the top of the tomb, what it looks like. Lastly, sorry. Lastly, sorry. The last dynasty is the Zhou, who overthrew the Shang in the late 12th century BCE and ruled all the way from 1027 to 221 BCE, split into the Western Zhou and Eastern Zhou periods. The Zhou justified taking over by claiming the last Shang king had become corrupt and given himself over to wine, tyranny, and greed, and the heaven basically withdrawn its support from him. This idea became known as the Mandate of Heaven, and under its ruler was now called the Son of Heaven, someone who kept heaven's support only as long as he governed wisely. The tricky part is the same logic could be used against the Zhou later on if they became weak. The Zhou also governed through a system kind of like feudalism, where the king granted land and titles to regional lords in exchange of military service and loyalty. But unlike Mesopotamia, they never really created formal written law codes. They relied on military force and political alliances, which made the whole system less stable over time. Eventually, those regional lords grew too powerful and the Zhou lost control, splitting into the Warring States period, which is also when Confucianism and Taoism developed. To wrap it up, political organization in early China moved from a small village leadership all the way to powerful, complex governments. The Xia established the idea of hereditary rule, saying staying within one family. The Shang expanded military power and political authority through the network of allied towns and a system that was closely tied to religion. And the Zhou brought in completely new idea about legitimate rule with the mandate of heaven, which ended up influencing Chinese governments for centuries afterward, way past the Zhou dynasty itself even ending. What ties all three together is that dynasty had to figure out to control each dynasty had to figure out how to control bigger populations, manage more territory, and maintain social order, and each one solved that problem a little differently. I think that I think that's what makes this such an interesting point in. I mean, sorry. I think that's what makes this such an interesting starting point for Chinese history, because a lot of political ideas that show up later, like a ruler needing legitimacy to justify their power, actually trace back all the way to this early period. That's it, and thank you for watching my presentation.